welcome Maátisák, Amenhetep, back to the stage as our moderator for this second panel, and let her introduce her presenters.
Awesome. Welcome back. So here we have Dr. Bill Cross, Jr., and he is one of America's leading theorists and researchers on Black identity development. His text, Shades of Black, is considered a classic in the field. So welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. And here we have Dr. Rodolfo Victoria, and he is a first-generation college student of Mexican descent and a very proud product of Los Angeles Unified School Education Systems. He completed his undergraduate studies at Cal State University of Los Angeles and majored in psychology. His focus was on the impact of race, racial identity, and racism on middle of the spectrum groups such as Asian Americans, and Latinos. And he also studied at Columbia University under Dr. Robert Carter, who's also another pioneer. Right now, he's at UC Irvine, and he is providing psychotherapy services to underrepresented university students. So welcome to the both of you. Dr. Cross,
hello.
It is such a pleasure. I cut my teeth on Dr. Cross's work back in the long time ago.
You're reminding me of my age.
You are one of the early pioneers in the field of Black psychology. In fact, your theories were percolating and evolving in the very early 1960s. So can you please tell us about your Negressance Model and how it has evolved?
Well, first I want to say thank God for the rain. Secondly, I lowered my speaker speed to come here because I had to come and meet people who were being asked to do the impossible. We were talking about it at the table. From our point of view, you're the miracle workers. Mm-hmm. We take kids and we create a pipeline from their schools to prison. We then put them in prison. We traumatize them. And then now you are going to help them transition back to society. And we're not going to provide any jobs, and we're going to give you minimum support. So you are miracle workers. That should be the title of this conference, the miracle workers. With that, okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
There were two origins to the discourse on modern Black identity. One comes out of Africa with Frantz Fanon. The other comes out of the American prison system with people like George Jackson and, of course, the icon Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. Their lives and their narratives filtered into the college arena, and we started talking about stages of identity development. Then when I came along, I tried to figure out how can we name this process in a way that'll catch people's attention. And so I borrowed a term from the Negritude Movement. The Negritude Movement was an African movement spearheaded by Africans who were Bantus. These are assimilated African scholars who had been to Europe. Mm-hmm. Okay. And when they went to Europe, they discovered the great European museums of African history. And so you have this irony of people who are PhDs, then traveling to Europe to be further assimilated, and in the process, they discovered their blackness. And so the term Negressance means, literally, to become black, the stages of becoming black. And they can be explained as most of the models, and Janet Helms is involved here, Robert Carter, the late Charlie Thomas. Mm-hmm. They started not with change, but with the identity before change. So I call that pre-encounter. Mm-hmm. And then there's the issue of the trigger, or that which ignites the epiphany, encounter. And then the vortex of change, the point in which the old self and the new self are battling. And I would love to be able to talk to Brother Speed about this, because that's his expertise, is helping people in that middle period to have the new identity overtake the old. And then we talked about a point in which there is some resolution, and we call that internalization, but it's usually internalization without commitment to community. And then the highest level would be internalization - commitment. And this is where people come to understand their commitment to community and that social justice is likely to take a long-term struggle. So that kind of summarizes almost all the models that we had. Negressance is a theory not about personality. We had the first speakers talking about damage to personality. Negressance is really asking the question, what am I going to do with my life? And incarceration symbolizes a meaning-making failure, the failure for me to make meaning of my life. When a person is released, they are asked to come to a point of renewal, to take stock of their situation. And then given adequate support and incentives, you can, quote, turn your life around. I mean, that's the hope. I don't know if this won't surprise people in the audience, but for the most part, studies would suggest that people who enter prison are not, we've almost overstressed the issue of damage. Because it's often that these are regular guys who have regular personalities, who under different circumstances, if there was employment, they would be regular people. And then they're ensnarled by the society. And then once they're in prison, that can lead to depression, damage to self-esteem, sexual identity disorientation, most profoundly, the crushing of one's purpose and one's sense of hope. The relationship between my work and the work that's being done in the room is that I try to point out that for the most part, Negressance is dealing with how do you make meaning of life. And that is, of course, the big issue in rehabilitation. Malcolm went into prison, just to remind us, as a pretty strong person. But how he lived his life got him into trouble. Then he has this epiphany, so that with this new epiphany, his new outlook, when attached to a strong personality, made for a giant of a figure. And therefore, over and over again, we have this realization that if somehow we can reach the person, if we can have them sincerely and authentically reevaluate their purpose, that increases the probability that there'll be that 33% who will manage to sustain existence outside the walls. Otherwise, if we can't get at hope, if we can't get at purpose, then in a sense the recidivism occurs. I think that's the last one. And we don't have time to deal with the more extended version of my theory, which is how do you live identity on a daily basis? And I have a handout, and I just didn't know how much time we would have. But my colleagues and I are trying to figure out how do we get people to understand that having a black identity or having a Chicano identity doesn't play itself out the same in every situation. Part of the identity is to help you size up the context. What situation am I in? If I'm in a situation of threat, then my identity has to protect me. I call that buffering. If I'm in a situation of opportunity, I have to figure out how do I go from in my community into someone else's community where their norms dominate. And the phrase that we use for that is code switching. And half the battle with rehabilitation is how do you get people comfortable with code switching, moving in and out of different spaces. This part is somewhat ironic. Sometimes we have to teach our own people to have encounters with their own people, but maybe the person in question is someone from Los Angeles, and then the potential friend is from Nigeria. So even though we are both people of African descent, the cultural divide is so great, we have to figure out a way to bridge between our two stances. So we call that bridging. So buffering, code switching, bridging, those are ways in which we negotiate relationships with the other. But then there's the issue of how we relate to ourselves. And one of the things that bothers me about racial identity discussions is that culture sometimes doesn't come into the picture. Culture means you have to develop a sense of attachment and bonding to your own people, to their history, to their culture, to their cuisine, to their issues. That's not race, okay? That's culture, that's ethnicity. And when it's engaged, it can cause someone like Anika Giovanni to roll out of her bed in the morning, hear the cacophony of birds and the wind rustling through the trees, and she writes a poem. But it's not a poem about dandelions, it's a poem about blackness. So there's a way in which your frame of reference causes you to see life in such a way that you want to perpetuate and continue your culture. So David Levering Lewis has written 2 books on W.E.B. Du Bois. You can't explain that because he's just a scholar. No, he's a black scholar in love with blackness. And he showed that affection to his community and to himself by writing 2 volumes, both of which are award-winning, if I'm making my point. But not every black person in the black community is your friend. So there are times in which you have to learn how to buffer, protect, if you will, against people who don't have your best interests in mind. And then code switching would be the example if Barack Obama were to walk into the room, we probably wouldn't say, hey, brother, what's happening, okay? We would first say, Mr. President. We would respect him. Now, if he got down later, we might be able to switch to a different frame of reference. Right. So we code switch with each other. So my work has tried to figure out a way to take blackness away from the mysterious, break it into everyday enactments. And then my biggest struggle is how do you get young people to embrace this? Not necessarily believe it. They have a right to reject it. But how do they embrace it? How do they talk about it? How do they chew it up and then spit it out in their own words? The idea of identity change is never going to go away. As long as you have oppression, then you're going to raise people to have false consciousness. So many of the folks that we work with are the victims of false consciousness.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, I just think, I mean, don't get me wrong. Trauma is a real issue. But the bigger issue in our community is not trauma. It is false consciousness. False consciousness causes you to look at yourself and your community through distorted lenses. If I have a view that most black people are either inferior or they're not worthy, then I'm not going to think about connecting with that community. So if my school system doesn't talk about slavery, or only talks about slavery as a period of crushed oppression, but it doesn't remind me that my ebonics comes from slavery, that my cuisine comes from slavery, that my tendency to feel a bondedness with my kin comes. In other words, if it isn't understood that slavery both explains the origin of white racism, but it also is a point in which people of African descent for over 200 years were in community, and they created a language system, they created a cuisine, they created a kin system, that in a sense, I don't understand how to make the relationship between myself and 2014 and my connection to that history, because it's a glorious history. I'll use that word. It's a joyous history. And once you make that connection, then when you have a school teacher, be she white, be she black, telling that you are not worthy or slavery was bad, you can push back. That's what made Malcolm so different after he came out of prison. He tooled himself with the facts of black life. And he became our champion. And that's why we loved it when we went on TV, because he would have some sets of idiots trying to tell him about blackness. He knew the facts, and he was able to push back. And that's why if you've ever met a scholar of African American history, or a scholar of Chicano history or Asian American history, they cannot be moved by false consciousness. But if I find a way to inject a large number of people in false consciousness, then they have no way to understand their personal glory because they're disconnected from it. And when you're disconnected from it, you don't feel as energized. You don't feel as capable. So that's why I believe the bigger problem is, I'm not minimizing trauma, don't get me wrong. But there's a psychological trauma in a people who don't know its own history. And that can lead to as many problems as not. So, for example, the biggest issue for our community is not our psychology, but the absence of employment. But if I accept the system the way it is, and that the system should not find a way to create employment at all stratas, then in a sense it almost makes me politically neutral. Not only should we be in the street for the number of people who are in prison, but we should be in the streets for the fact that people who are ordinary, who are as good as anyone else, there's no outlet for their creativity. There's no outlet. We have fewer marriages, not because people got up one day and say, I'm not going to marry, because marriage in the United States requires material well-being. I feel like I'm rambling, and I don't.
Well, I wanted to go back to your book, Shades of Black, Diversity and African American Identity. You mentioned that your goal was to refocus Black psychology away from that of self-hatred and the social pathology model, which at that time had largely prevailed, and bring attention to the variability of one's identity and the phenomenon of identity transformation. Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. Probably too much, but remember that in the Supreme Court decision, you had the following irony. In order for us to get the justices to, quote, give us our political rights, they wouldn't accept information about discrimination. They wouldn't accept discrimination in housing. They wouldn't accept information about discrimination in employment. So Kenneth Clark had to come along with some Dow studies that purportedly showed that discrimination causes our children psychological damage. Now think about that. Person is asking for their political rights, but they first have to show that they're a basket case. Okay. So then it turns out that there were many studies that have been done, I shouldn't say many, there have been enough studies done to show that most Black people were not self-hating. They were ordinary people living under a system of oppression. Some of them were damaged, but the majority were not. So my work tried to show, so for example, I'll give you an example very quickly. One of the things that Clark did and argued about is that some of the children in his experiment cried. That is to say, when they were shown the black doll and the white doll, they became so uncomfortable and they cried. But Uri Brafenbrenner has taught us, if you take any children and put them into a strange room with a strange experimenter, somebody is going to cry. So I just simply pointed that out, and then I went back and I showed that the percentage of Black children in those experiments who cry was less than 3%.
That's interesting.
And it turns out, if you look at their data, when their data was collected in the Deep South, most of the Deep South children, by the time they got to be 7 or 8, identified brown. Most of the children who were showing some ambiguity were in the North. And in some instances, they were kids whose body type was more ambiguous. That is to say, they weren't showing self-hatred. If they identified with a light doll, they were identifying with their own color. So I tried to show step by step by step that the whole premise of self-hatred was on shaky grounds. And that, in a sense, the bigger issue with Black people was not their personality issues, but their frame of reference about being Black.
Okay, I'm going to thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to go into Dr. Victoria. You've done extensive research examining racial identity issues among Latinos and Asians. Your research has focused on applying racial identity theory to Hispanic and Latino populations and examining how this knowledge can assist in providing more appropriate mental health services to these populations. Dr. Victoria, what does the term psychological trauma mean? And in particular, what does it mean in your research? And why is it an important term to understand? These are several questions. And how might it relate to today's discussion?
Sure. Let me again just echo how grateful I am to be here. It's a tremendous honor to be here with all of you. Miracle Workers is apropos. I think the work that you all do is tremendous. One of the challenges that I often face in these type of discussions is sometimes I think we can approach this from a very academic, esoteric kind of place, which is intellectually stimulating and interesting, but I want it to be helpful and useful for you all as well. So I will try to be as succinct as possible. which can be very difficult, and hopefully leave some time for some questions, because I think you all are on sort of the front line, and you know, I think perhaps more than I do, actually, what is going on. So I want to throw out that caveat. I think the first presenters did a marvelous job of sort of talking about trauma and psychological trauma. So I think the angle that I will approach it now is, in my work with Dr. Carter on race-based traumatic stress, what we've come to recognize is that as mental health providers and clinicians, when we think of trauma, we tend to think of PTSD. We tend to go to the DSM-4, which will soon become the DSM-5, and that is sort of what we use as an assessment tool to figure out whether someone has been traumatized. Again, it'll be interesting to see how the DSM-5 changes, but in the DSM-4 TR, there is maybe one mention of racism and discrimination. It is invisible in our psychiatric and psychological assessment tools. It doesn't exist. It has some caveats about you should consider cultural factors and environmental factors, which is a very obscure way of talking about racism and discrimination. When you look at the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, what you find is we have to be talking about some pretty serious event that occurs in your life in order for it to meet that criteria. So usually these are things like a natural disaster, rape, being brutally beaten. There is no voice for these experiences that we're talking about, these experiences that inmates are talking about or face in prison. There is no place for racial discrimination. So that begs the question, well, how do we provide support and treatment? How do we develop treatment interventions for these experiences that aren't acknowledged and recognized in the field of psychology and psychiatry? There's evidence for this in other ways as well. Interestingly, I think it was in the 1970s, racial discrimination and harassment was recognized in the courts in terms of in the work setting. From that, in the 1980s, sexual discrimination and harassment was developed with that notion. Nowadays, almost every institution has very clear guidelines and procedures for recognizing sexual harassment and discrimination, and there's a very clear process for that, how to go about that. It doesn't matter whether the intention of the perpetrator was to be sexually harassing. The target or victim of sexual harassment and discrimination simply has to have a subjective sense of feeling that they are being harassed or discriminated based on their gender. This is not the case for racial discrimination and harassment. It is so difficult if you experience racism in your life, and particularly in a work setting, to make a claim that that was your experience. It is the burden of proof falls on the plaintiff or the complainant to prove that the alleged perpetrator of racial discrimination had racial animus, and that their reason for causing the reason for their actions were based on racial intent. This is why I think anywhere the range is from 60 to 80% of all racial discrimination suits fail. 80%, they fail, which can lead to a re-traumatization and an invalidation of the experiences that people of color face. So the work that I and my colleagues have done with race-based traumatic stress is to let's loosen this strict criteria of PTSD so that these type of experiences can be acknowledged and hopefully treatment interventions can be developed. As a quick example, I recently attended a training on providing psychological services to combat veterans who have suffered and been diagnosed with PTSD. The training was on cognitive processing therapy, CPT. Very specific interventions. It was a 2-day, 6-hour training, so 12-hour training on providing treatment, empirically based treatment for combat veterans. Fantastic work, great work. There is no such thing. There is no such tool for targets of racism, targets of discrimination. And I will quickly say, the take-home message of that training was that one of the critical ingredients of effective intervention was acknowledgement. Helping the individual tell their story, acknowledge their story, and combat all the messages that they tell themselves, that society has told them, that what you went through was not that big of a deal. You're being sensitive, you're being hypervigilant, suck it up, man up in the case of veterans, which creates this vicious cycle that there's something wrong with me. So my type of work tries to take us away from the strict adherence of PTSD diagnosis and recognize that there is other trauma that is equally valid and equally destructive in our communities.
Now, Dr. Victoria, you mentioned earlier about the tool, and you were involved in the initial development of the race-based traumatic stress symptom scale. Can you tell us about it and how you use it?
So, admittedly, right now where we are at with this tool is in the development stages. The article just got printed in the Psychology Trauma Journal last year. So a lot of the discussion and articles and publications on this is very academic and theoretical in nature, which is important. I recently spoke with Professor Carter, and I've been working with him. We are trying to create a manual for practitioners to use, and that will hopefully be in publication later on this year. He mentioned to me, and he said that it was fine for me to share this with you also. I will. If you have an interest in getting an advanced copy of this manuscript, you can contact him. If you want to grab my card, I can give you his email, or you can also look up Robert Carter. He's not too hard to find. So there is more information about the instrument itself and how it can be applied. The interesting thing about this race-based traumatic stress scale is similar to the CPT training that I went to. What we do is we meet with an individual and we tell them, tell us your experiences of racism and discrimination. I've had folks tell me anywhere from 1 event to 15 events. What this tool does then is ask them, of these events, granted all of them probably impactful and meaningful in some way, which of these events stands out to you? They select, I don't select. They select which event was meaningful to them, which may be influenced by racial identity as well. What we did was we asked them, from recalling this event, we gave them a list of questions regarding their reactions, their psychological mood, their emotions, and other symptoms. And what it really helps to do, it creates a direct link between the experience and the impact. What happens right now in psychology is that most of the scales on racism and racial discrimination are very generic. They're very broad. They ask you, list a bunch of experiences that you had, you get a total score, and then they correlate that total score to symptoms. And the evidence is pretty prevalent. Racism is not good for your health. Essentially, that's what the research shows. Right. Not a newsflash. But that doesn't help us understand how we can intervene and help you deal with this specific event. We don't know that. And so this scale is trying to advance the research on racism by being more specific about what specific event is impacting you. And I think that's such an exciting thing, and I'm looking forward to this new publication to be coming out soon.
Awesome. And my understanding is that this tool will be able to assess the emotional impact,
yes,
specifically of racism.
That's right.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. I would like to ask you another question. You're a native of East Los Angeles, yes?
Yes.
And you're the first member of your family to attend a post-secondary educational institution. Does your personal story have any bearing on your research interest?
Yes. So the answer is yes. Something that my colleagues and I in graduate school talked about, and I'm sure we didn't invent this, most of the research that I do, and I think that most people do, is we call it me-search. We try to find meaning for our life experiences. I sit here in front of everyone with full recognition that at first glance, I probably look nothing like a traditional, whatever that means, Latino. That was my experience throughout life in East LA. And I feel like that is a story that a lot of not only Chicanos, but Salvadorians, Nicaraguans, the whole spectrum. We don't know who we are a lot of times because there's so much discussion and confusion about what is Latino enough. And I think this happens actually across my Asian brothers and sisters, my black brothers and sisters, Middle Eastern brothers and sisters, my white brothers and sisters. It happens across all of groups. But in my personal experience, you know, being able to speak Spanish and having 2 Mexican parents, that wasn't enough credentials for me to be because I didn't speak Mexican enough. I didn't speak Spanish enough. I was being educated. All these internalized racist messages that our communities, internalized, created this dynamic where no matter what I did to try to improve myself, improve the people around me, it was considered as selling out. And I had no language what was going on. I was so confused. Am I American? Am I Mexican? Why can't I be both? The work of Dr. Cross, Dr. Helms, Dr. Carter, and others gave me a language to understand, like, this is something that we all go through. Language is such an important piece. And if there's one thing that I hope you all walk away with, it's with some new terms, some new ideas that can help normalize and contextualize the people that you're working with. I've been having an amazing set of dialogues here with my fellow presenters, and each of us from different angles talk about how acknowledgement, making the invisible visible, that is so therapeutic. So when I first read Negressance theory, people of color racial identity theory, I felt like a person. I felt acknowledged. And from that experience, I have an incredible amount of gratitude, but this sense of obligation to do research that highlights the experiences and life stories of not only my people, Latino people, but of other groups. I know because we're focusing on incarceration that Black and Latinos get highlighted, but we cannot forget that this also applies to our other brothers and sisters.
Thank you. I actually have another question for Dr. Cross. You and your daughter have published some very important work together on racial identity over a lifespan, self-esteem, et cetera. It has been rumored that the two of you are working on a new article about the role of spirituality and personality development. How might that benefit this discussion today?
My daughter, Tori Binta Cross, we call her Binta, which is an Anglicization of an African Benta. We didn't know at the time that Kunta Kinte's mother in Africa was Binta. We felt proud about it after the fact. We are both spiritual, but not religious. And we have an interest in the gay and lesbian community, who are often rejected outright by almost all religions, yet they don't stop wanting to be spiritual.
Right.
So we're trying to figure out how do people go through stages of internalizing a sense of spirituality. And it turns out that some of the stages they go through are very similar to the Negressance stages. So we're thinking about writing a piece together. And our audience are those people who maybe have turned away from organized religion, and yet they still feel internally a spirit. And we wanted to write about how that's normal. That could be another way of constructing your connection, if not to a divine being, but to a sense of purpose. On the way in, I was reading the student's paper, and it captures the moment. She said that she had been raised by a mom who was Native American, who did not necessarily relate to organized faith, but she taught the young lady that she is spiritual because she's alive and she's part of nature. And this is what she wrote. She says, each day when I look at nature, that is my cathedral. And the understanding that I have the same life force in me as does the rock, as does the tree, as does the plant. And I think that's something we hope to try to articulate in our piece.
Awesome, awesome. And I also have a question for you. How could we apply racial identity development theories to psychotherapy processes and outcomes, organizational development, mental health disparities, and race-based traumatic stress outcomes on mental health? Because we have a diverse group here.
Sure. So this is a difficult topic, I will admit, because I think sometimes what happens is we read racial identity theory, we want to sort of directly apply it to our work. I think on one level, what it helps us do is it helps us empathize. Yalom and other fantastic therapists always say it's the relationship that heals. Mm-hmm. You could be Sigmund Freud, but if you cannot connect with your client, you will be ineffective. I don't care what degrees or credentials you have. You can know all the skills in the world, but if you don't have an ability to connect with people, you will be ineffective. What racial identity theory and the work and the research done, the way I've seen it sort of impact these different outcomes, if you can understand the theories behind it, it can help you, avoid stereotypes. I think really the crux of racial identity theory is not everyone who's in the Latino, Mexican label or box is the same. Mm-hmm. Not all African Americans are the same. Racial identity theory, it highlights the variability of what meaning individuals make about their race and about their culture. So if you can understand that, you're already one step closer to being able to connect with your clients. So really, racial identity theory is a way of connecting. What's difficult for me is, I think when we have these dialogues, it's often about the other. How can I help this person? How can I help this institution? How can I do this? The real work, I think, or an important work, I should put it this way, is the work we do ourselves.
Yes.
How can I challenge myself and take a look at what race means to me and how race impacts me? Because when you understand how these factors impact you, then you're in a much better position to really understand how race impacts the client you're working with.
Can I take a shot at that?
Yes, please.
An ism, such as sexism, tries to make you feel you're the problem. Mm-hmm. So the power of racism is to make the individual black person feel that they are a problem. Mm-hmm. When in reality, it's someone else's problem. But they have the power to impose their problem on you. Mm. That's why if you just deconstruct racism, it's a partial victory. Because you're still left with the question, how do I define myself as a black person? Mm-hmm. And that can't be done through someone else's discourse. Mm-hmm. That requires that you go deep into the history of your own people's existence. Mm. So there's two ways to define myself as a black entity. Someone else's problem, and that means part of my identity has to negotiate the power of someone's ability to impose that on me. So Brother Speed and I were talking about that. So part of 12th step, he'll talk about it himself, is how do you get to understand that you're living someone else's problem. Right. But part of the strength that makes you internally strong is not only do you not see yourself as a problem, but you identify with the culture, with the language, with the history, with the triumphs. Mm-hmm. When you put those two babies together, an internal heartbeat that is beating from the drum of your own people, and an understanding that someone is trying to oppress me, that they have the power to do it, it can politically realign you, it can spiritually realign you, it just gives you more strength.
Yes.
And that's when Malcolm was free. Mm-hmm. Think about this. He's in a prison and he feels free. He understands that I'm in the prison because through my false consciousness, I live the life that they wanted me to live. Mm-hmm. And then within a prison, he understood that when I get out, and he did, of course, I can live a life driven more so by my own frame of reference. Mm-hmm. And that is one of the hardest things for the people in the audience to do, to get to get the person to understand that half the battle is perspective. Perspective not only about self, but also about the other. But when it's done, it is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. So this question is for you, Dr. Cross. Rumor has it that you will be presenting at the American Psychological Association's annual convention this coming August 2014, and that you plan to emphasize 2 key topics, your first being the mass incarceration of people of color. Could we possibly get a sneak preview of what you might be sharing?
Well, this is braggadocio time, okay? I'm the president of Division 45. Division 45 is the Society for the Study of Race, Culture, Ethnicity. As president, I got to be able to set the priority for our conference. And then I asked that we give priority to 2 issues. The intersection of being a person of color and being gay or lesbian, and then also mass incarceration. So it is because of my directive that our entire program is scaffolded around those theses. I myself am going to talk about some of the issues that I ran through very quickly, and I have some handouts you can pick up later. And that is how identity is enacted on a daily basis. I ran through that a little bit earlier. That'll be my own personal talk.
Okay.
And it could be of some use when you're, again, negotiating the perspectives of people who are reconnecting with the larger society. And my concern is that there's a tendency sometimes for our young people to want to think that blackness is played out in one way. And when there's a preoccupation upon protection, called buffering, we have found the following phenomena. If a person defines their identity primarily as an issue of protection, they are more vulnerable.
Today we have a diverse audience in attendance. We have people who work in the mental health and substance abuse recovery settings. How many people are from mental health? Wow, okay. How about substance abuse? Okay, all right. And then we also have people who are in community corrections. We got a couple of you. Okay, awesome, welcome, welcome. And what about family members? Family members, awesome. Advocates, any advocates in the room? Awesome, okay. And what about from the faith-based communities? Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, so how might such a diverse audience apply some of the tools that you all have been talking about in their work with this population?
My own bias is to not approach clients with a deficit perspective. I think you've lost half the battle if you do that. And to emphasize what it, to get close to how do they narrate life? How do they organize life? What is their perspective on life? How do they make meaning of life? Do they have a sense of hope? Because when you have a normal person, by normal I mean, for the most part, the pathologies are not so strong. We all are not perfect, obviously. And they have a frame of reference which lacks hope. It is very hard to move that person one step. But you can have a neurotic person who has a sense of hope, and it's amazing what they can accomplish. So that's easier said than done, because most people develop miseducated frames of reference because they tested it, and it seems to work. And so you're asking people to give up on a tested life perspective. And you're asking them to take a chance on some perspective that you are selling them, that they haven't been able to live yet. And that is very hard to do.
Sounds like a huge cognitive shift.
Most, I'm at the risk of people throwing tomatoes at me. Most of this is existential. It is existential. That's why Viktor Frankl, in his book, he says, you could be in a concentration camp and have some of your previous friends sent to the camp, to the chambers the day before. And yet what's amazing is that people still try to figure out, what is today about? So coming out of prison with all the trauma that has been expressed by the speakers who just left us, those people have a right to be broken. And you're asking them not to be broken. That's a hell of a conversation. It's a hell of a conversation.
Not to ask.
And yet, we have to be hopeful. Malcolm is not an oddity. Malcolm was one among hundreds of thousands of black men and women who have been treated poorly. He's an icon, but he wasn't the only one. And when you know that, then you as a practitioner can be hopeful. Because it may be the little Malcolm in front of you. It may be the little Angela Davis in front of you. And they may, for the moment, they may need your strength of vision in order for them to better understand where they can go. That is the power of therapy. It's not that you have the answers, but you have the ability to create a safe space for them to entertain something that they thought was totally radical. And that is a new me, a new me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to open it up for questions. So if you could quickly move to the mics, and whoever gets there first gets to talk first. Not all at once.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dwayne McShane. Hallelujah.
I couldn't hear your first question.
I'll say my name is Dwayne McShane. I want to speak on what you were speaking on. Until we learn, hallelujah, there's really no color. We are one. One. Life has gave, like the Tower of Babylon, life has given us you are you are this, you pink, you blue, you yellow. No, everybody is made in his image and his likeness. And I haven't did no, I lived the life, just say that, lived the life. I have ate lobster, soul food, as you say, tacos. Until you live a person's life like Jesus, that's why he came. Until you walk in my shoes, you just guessing how it feels. But when I go to your house and I lay down with you, I ain't got to guess no more. This is how you live. Till I go to the homeless people and lay down with them, I can read all the books I want to read. That's just reading. Until I actually become a part of you, you and me is you. Quit letting them divide us. We are people. I'm human. 100% American. I'm not black. That dog is black. I ain't never seen a black person. I seen a dark person. I never seen a white person. His paper is white. No, not for me anyway. Malcolm, assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum salam. Until you free this mind, you can put me where you want. Anywhere, name it. I already been homeless. You can put me in the White House. I know how many forks do you put. I know how many you get. Nothing you can do to a man that's free in his mind. Nothing. That's why you could be in jail and be right here free as a bird. Because you cannot capture this, like Martin Luther King. There's nothing you can do with this here. Once it's free,
Thank you. Thank you.
It's kind of like, how do you follow that?
Yeah, that's what
Well
I'm trying to
stated.
figure out myself here.
How are you?
Hi, how are you doing? It's really great having both of you here. My name is Mel Mason. I'm Executive Director and Clinical Director for an Afrocentric African American Family Resource Center called the Village Project, located in Seaside, California, Monterey County. And for those of us who have done some kind of study around racial identification theory, and I think some of the work obviously has been done by Helms, and there have been some stuff that's been done by people like Thomas Parham, who I know you work with down at UC Irvine, right? And then, of course, there's Naeem Akbar, and I had read Dr. Cross, his kind of critique of your theory. But one of the things that I'm finding by listening to you is that there really is a centrality placed by you on spirituality. And so I was glad to hear you kind of discount something that Brother Naeem had mentioned as a critique. But I'm just wondering, in terms of being able to apply a certain approach, to working with someone from whatever different group, whatever group that they're from, is there still a question, one, of defining a cultural definition of normalcy for each group? And also, is there still an unresolved issue for counseling in this realm around definitional clarity? I don't know if that makes any sense to you. It might not even be making sense to me at this point. But definitional clarity is actually being able to define concretely, different approaches that need to be applied to someone from one racially identified group, based on that person's experience. I don't know if that's those are a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
What comes up for me, and I appreciate the comment and question, what comes up for me as you were speaking was, how do we define normal? And we can get deep with this, and perhaps we could do that another time, but Professor Cross here was sharing about power. Who gets to define what is normal? What is normal for me? That is sort of what I was alluding to earlier about engaging in your own exercise of self-reflection about what is your experience, what are your cultural worldviews, and how do they impact what you define as normal. There is some research on racial identity which has shown that the racial identity development or the status or stage, whatever term you want to use, of the counselor is a critical ingredient for being able to move the client in that direction, for them to sort of develop a positive identity of their race. Your ability to sort of go through that journey, you're not going to be able to help someone go through that journey if you haven't gone through that journey yourself. So it is critical, I believe, and this is where I put a lot of emphasis and work on in my research. How can we help you understand yourself and the impact of race and culture and how that impacts your view of the world and what is normal? Because once you have that awareness, you can check that when you're working with a person. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but that was what was coming up for me.
That was one of the most polite critiques of my not being Afrocentric enough that I've ever heard. When you are dealing with a segment of our community that has been, whose blackness has been made very thick, that lends itself to precise discussion about what blackness is about. But I have a friend, an evolving friend, in the city where I work. He is from the islands. He is the president, the chief operating person for Coors. That should tell you a lot. His reality is so different from some other brothers and sisters I know that I can't approach my Afrocentric friends the same way I would approach this friend. And this is the great dilemma of the issue of race. Race is, in social category, intersects with social class, intersects with gender. I've had trouble with some of the folks that you talked about because they took the Association of Black Psychologists and they made it very hostile for black people who are gay. So when I stood up and said, fuck that, that's just not what we want to be about, then I got pushback. But I wasn't saying we should not concern ourselves with our history or our origins and so on. I didn't say that. But when someone has a rigid frame of reference, and if you mess with one of their tenets, then they wipe you out. I just have trouble with that. That part of the problem in the black community today is that we are a victim of our own success. Every social, formally stigmatized group that has been able to get up from under the stigma tends to become more Americanized, tends to become more friendly to the system. And I mean this respectfully from my Jewish brothers and sisters in the room, but at one point they were the radicals of American society. And then as they were accepted, they became the people on the right. I have no illusions, in fact we're already seeing this, that as more and more black people succeed, a higher percentage of them become people who are voicing the right. I mean, think about it. We went from Thurgood Marshall. You know what the rest of the sentence is? Yeah. And yet, if anything, the man who is in there now is, quote, darker than Marshall. So that's the kind of issue I care. I'm glad you asked it. I hope I handle it respectfully, except for the four-letter word, but whatever, okay.
Thank you.
My psychology is less about a particular frame of reference. I call that the must-be psychology. What must I be like to be black? What must I be like to be gay? No. I like to study black folk the way they are. The only group that I have a lot of trouble with, I'm respectful in their presence, are those persons who stand up and say, I am black, but it's unimportant. They get under my skin, okay? But except for those persons who are flat out saying that race has no relevance in life, then I just am prepared for us to be all over the place. I have a sister who is as fair as I am. And when I'm with her talking about race, sometimes she makes my blood curl, you know, because her ideas about being black are just so weird. And yet my lost brother, who just passed away a year ago, I mean, he was a race man to the point where it was funny. Because he's married to an Irish woman, right? And sometimes one of his biracial kids would come home, and he would say something almost to the effect, you're not black enough.
Wow.
And they would say, that's right, because I love mother too. Yet that I found out that Lee, when she went to school, she was the one that was promoting black culture. She was the one that was writing plays. She was the one engaging white students across these racial boundaries. So I think that as a theorist, I have an obligation to my people to be able to explain as many of the varieties of my people as I can. And I can't do that with a preset notion of what it means to be black.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Majuxus Katina Miwu, Kanyasis Albert, Bizumata Miwu. And I say welcome to all my people. My name is Albert. I'm Miwok. We're Bear Clan people. So my people originated from right here. Right here. That's our creation stories, right here on the land that we stand on now. And you know, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and be a part of this this discussion because you know, our histories, many of our histories parallel. But we know that here in this country, in the United States, you know, Native people, we have a unique history, and one that is filled with beauty from pre-contact to, you know, destruction, devastation, and even genocide. And so we have a history that when we talk about trauma, you know, maybe we can look at some forms of PTSD, but the historical trauma, the intergenerational trauma, is what we're dealing with today in our communities, in our reservations, our rancherias, even here in our urban settings, you know, with forced removal, forced relocation, forced assimilation. And so I appreciate the opportunity and really, really enjoy your research and your study. I appreciate it a lot. And in the work that we're doing today in the Native community, and I won't be here in the afternoon to get to talk about some of the evidence-based or community-defined practices, but that this is what the prophecy has been told. So when we go back and we listen to elder teaching and intergenerational teaching, what we're talking about today is what was told generations back. And it's amazing when I sit here and I listen and I look around the room, and we're very diverse, just in this room in general, and even amongst our cultures as Native people, we're very diverse. We have different languages, different songs, different customs, but there are some unique and some parallels in how we're healing today. And we look at the circle as being very sacred. Circles and cycles, the cycles of life are. You said it earlier, that you used that example of the young lady and her grandmother teaching her about, or her mother, about the connection to all things and the relationship to all things. That's how we're healing today. It's in this relationship that we have with each and every one of us in this room. When we find that place of understanding, like the brother was saying earlier, we're all one race. So when I say I'm Miwok, I'm pretty much just saying I'm human. When my relatives say they're Lakota, they're saying I'm the people, which means I ain't no different than you or me or anybody else. I'm no different than the rain falling or the bird singing or that tree dropping its acorn, its babies, right? And so in this time of healing that we're in, this has been told generations and generations. And, you know, I used to say, like, man, this is the best time in many generations to be Native American. But I started thinking about that, really processing that, you know, talking to others. It's always been a great time to be a Native person. And when we look at our ancestors and what they had to do to get us to this place, man, it had to be a blessed time for them also just to survive, reservation life, because originally reservation was no different than concentration camps. They were prisons, and they were placed there to survive any way that they could survive, depending on the government. Today, in Native communities, we realize we can't depend on the government if we're going to survive. We can't depend on grants, you know, even though we write for them and we hope we get them, and when we do, it's a blessing. But it starts with me. It starts with that brother sitting in the back room. Mike Duncan, raise your hand. That man is doing great work in our community with our fathers. You know, and we're starting a nonprofit, but this man's been doing the work for a couple years with no money. He just started a circle in the community, and men started coming, and it's grown from one man to the next, and then that man going back to his families, and the majority of them being formerly incarcerated individuals, right? And it's the basis of culture. Identity, like you were talking about earlier, like I know who I am now. I'm Miwok. I know what that means to me, and I know what that meant to my ancestors. So we talk about the 7-generation teachings, going back 7 generations to understand who and why I am today. Somebody prayed for me 7 generations back that I would get this opportunity to stand here and share this with you all. And the work that we're doing now, we talk about it. We're teaching the men that we're doing this work for 7 generations ahead. I won't get to see that. Yeah, I think Martin Luther King said that. I may not get to the promised land, but I'm doing this work. It's the same concept. It is 7 generations from now, my great-great-great-great-grandchildren will see what we're talking about here and the prophecy coming true. They'll live it. So they may not ever have to experience prison, you know, like I had to experience prison. And so that's what we're hoping for here. And I'm really excited about, I wasn't sure what to expect when we were invited here by Mary Nakamura. Thank you, Mary. And but man, this is beautiful. This is prophecy. It really is. And so, again, I applaud all your work, but we have a lot of work to do. Miwok people, we have a lot of work to do. But we've come a long way. And it's going to take that understanding to break down those barriers of race, to truly understand each other and appreciate each other's cultures. Because we say we're not different, but we are, and we're unique. And that's beautiful, right? It's beautiful that we get to stand here and share. You can share your religion, and I understand it. You don't have to force it upon me like they did in boarding school. But I respect and understand it, but understand my culture. Because in our culture is our religion. In our culture is spirituality.
That's right.
We pray to all things. That's our culture. That's our way. And so, I can go on and start rambling like my relative sitting in the chair up there. But I wanted that opportunity to say that before I leave. So, thank you, kamo, which means thank you.
Thank you.
In our language. Oh.
Okay, just to wrap up here, I want to ask, why is it important for us to understand how racial identity gets developed? For what purpose do we need to assess the impact of racism on this particular population? How will it help?
I think quite simply, and I feel like this has been the theme so far and will continue to be a theme, it's just giving a voice to the voiceless. Giving a name and a label for the experiences that we go through and that the people that we work with go through. Quite simply.
Thank you. Thank you.
Racial identity helps you to figure out what just happened. Whoa, what was that? And usually human beings, when they can better understand how they're feeling and what just happened, it makes it a little bit easier for them to make sense for the next step. There's almost a frigging magic to self-insight. And self-insight sometimes require that you deconstruct these mystical illusions around the power of race. As the young brother said, think about it. The scientific knowledge says we are all from the same origins. Okay. We are all, in some ways, we are all African people. Okay.
This is true.
Yet we find ways to categorize each other. Well, the issue is not our humanity. The issue is in the power ability to categorize. Racial identity is one way of deconstructing the categories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank Dr. Cross and Dr. Victoria for sharing their wisdom with us. Thank you.